Hello and welcome to Conversations About Language Teaching. I'm Reed Riggs, he, him.
Hi, I'm Diane Neubauer, she, her.
And Diane, do you want to lead this episode?
I am happy to do so. This is our special question and answer episode. We'll focus in on questions that we've received by email and some that came in on YouTube, and sometimes things that came up, people asked about in a podcast category. So our first one is from Andy, and he notes that people often talking about communicative language classrooms, people will ask, like, but what does that look like?
Hmm.
And he acknowledges this really takes time. It's hard to get a sense for that. And he asks if we have any videos of us or a coworker teaching in the style that we describe in the podcast episodes.
Hmm.
And so maybe we can broaden that to, like, how would somebody get more of those, but what does it look like
Hmm.
questions
Yeah.
answered?
Yeah.
And then there's a
Well,
follow-up to that.
yeah. I think first I want to say happy New Year, happy 2025.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question. Um, so I guess I want to first give some framing, I guess, that Diane and I are constantly talking about like new ways to look at new ways to talk about what teachers do. Like we've both been involved in language teacher circles, including the national level with ACTFL, international with we go to the Ajan workshop in France, the comprehensible input communities of teachers. I emphasize that that's plural communities.
Yeah.
Um, and there's lots of overlap and disagreement among a lot of different groups. And we also have done research. We both completed PhDs that involved a lot of looking at research that involves communicative language teaching, and other things that tie in with that. My emphasis was more in theories of what language is, how the mind processes language, and how people organize themselves in interaction and bigger society structures. Diane looked at that as well and did work with that. We've worked on that together. And Diane, you could probably say a bit about your education focus.
Yeah, it's I was very interested in kind of I think of it as rotating around the role of the teacher in developing students' outcomes, and the student experience in acquiring another language in a classroom setting. And so I kind of have a teacher-centered thinking about what's happening in a classroom a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about what is the teacher doing, making decisions about fostering, encouraging for students. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, thinking of it combining
Yeah.
general education stuff, motivational thinking, interaction
Yeah.
types of stuff, and
So,
then SLA informed,
right.
like both cognitive and social aspects to
Yeah.
second language
The,
acquisition.
the reason I wanted to put all this up front is that I think you and I have lots of ideas and wishful thinking about next steps, like next places where teachers could go. And you innovate constantly with your students. I shared with you about things that I did at the Ajan workshop that I felt
Mhm.
was like I'm calling it radically communicative. That's a term that I want it to stand out as something that's meant to be different. So I think we should talk about what we see teachers do and what is likely something you could find in a video to watch happen that is very, very good. I'm not criticizing that. It's just I'm always looking to see what else can I do. And
Yeah.
so I think we can also comment about extra things that we think would be even more communicative, as I'll call it right now. So I could just say first that you can go to, I know that HALT, the Hawaii Association of Language Teachers, I'm just speaking locally for myself. We have a big collection of videos from our summer summit meetings from 2018, 2019. I think when COVID hit in 2020, we did a summer Zoom recordings, and they're mostly all on YouTube. And so we should link to that in the show notes.
Yeah.
And you can see lots of examples. And within that, you'll see teachers each having their own kind of unique spin on what it means to teach communicatively.
Yeah.
Yeah, Diane, do you want to say something?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, as it should be. You'll
Yeah,
so you go in thinking, let me see how I can understand this teacher, their goals. I like that thing as I watched, huh? Oh, that would be different than what I would do. And
yeah,
like coming into it with a curiosity mindset,
yeah.
rather than a mindset of they're doing it perfectly. I better do it like that.
Right.
I think that's especially when somebody's new and they're getting new ideas and they're like I see, and I have myself felt so often in language teaching, there's this push towards perfection, and I don't want to do it wrong. And
Yeah,
if I do it exactly this way, then I will get the result that I want. And
yeah.
it's not that precise. This
We've
is
seen
an
this
art as
in the
well as a
in
science.
in the Facebook groups a lot, where teachers are saying, "Okay, I'm doing XYZ," and they describe it pretty well, pretty good enough to know kind of what they're doing, and they'll say, "But I just don't know if it's correct." No, that's just, I'm just going to say no. Like, don't
Yeah,
ask that
yeah.
question. Don't
Take
ask
that out.
yourself that question. Like, it's not
Yeah.
about right or wrong.
Yeah.
Um,
And I would say like there would be some things that we would say like, yeah, I don't want to do that. But even then, like to look at like, well, what's the goal of that?
yeah,
What does that do for the learner? What
yeah,
does that do in this system which
yeah,
has this kind of pressure to XYZ?
yeah,
So in like I don't prefer to teach direct grammar
yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
But if I had a student ask a question, I will stop and do that
yeah,
briefly. And
yeah,
so, like, if somebody observed that, they'd be like, "Oh, see, you have to." No, that's
yeah,
not really what I meant. I was judging, the comfort of my student and their curiosity about this thing
yeah.
takes precedence over my general principle, which would be let's use language to communicate. Let's focus on the student's comprehension and
Right.
responsiveness to that.
I
So,
personally don't like using much English at all in class, but I actually do use a lot of English in class, and I don't like that I do it. And it's because I have very resistant, very unwilling students. Sometimes just out of a general kind of mysterious, maybe don't want to be there kind of motivation. And for other students, they're asking me, what is the grade? What is this for? Is this a formative or a summative? What exactly are you asking me to do? And so I've created some posters in Chinese that I can point to. It's like I can point to it and say, 这个是形成性评估. This is a formative assessment. Or if they ask me in English, I'll point to it and they'll go, oh, 这个是总结性评估嘛? Is this a
yeah,
summative assessment? It's like I have a little bit, but the complexity of their questions are always precise beyond what I can have posters to point to for. So we end up using a lot of English. So my bigger point here is that your student group, each student group is unique and has unique demands, and you have to adapt around them. I've seen student groups that just don't like silliness, and so when you see a video of a teacher being wacky, that was for those students.
right,
That wackiness was tailored for what those students showed that they enjoyed and that they were willing to participate in.
right.
And so if you try something silly and you don't get a response, try something else, try something less silly, and maybe something a little more personal, grounded in reality. See if students respond to that.
Yeah,
And sometimes you have to break into English or students shared maybe native
yeah,
language and say,
yeah,
hold on, this is what we're trying to do right now. This is how you participate. This is what our goals are. This is the kind of experience you need to have. Sometimes you have to actually explain. I found that I have to explain to my students. Um, like I had some pictures from a skewer house. We had a Chinese skewer house we went to. I took lots of photos, brought them into my class, and I just told the students up front, I'm going to tell you about a restaurant I went to this weekend. It's a Chinese restaurant. Might be relevant to you because it's a Chinese language class. And I expect you to understand 5% of what I say. And they said, oh, okay. I said, if you can just
yeah,
see the pictures and kind of sort of know that I, ate these things, that's all I'm asking for. And then I did something that I actually aimed for more. I was trying to help them understand the general meaning at about maybe 30 or 40%. But I wanted to really, really lower their expectations because I see that they're often so quick
mm,
to dive out, just to like evacuate,
yeah.
or they're
You're
just
gonna
like,
test me or something.
they're like, yeah, they'll turn to each other and go like, I don't know what's going on right now. Hey, what did you do this
Oh,
weekend? Hey, what's the best
oh,
soda? Like they just
yeah,
get off. And so I was
way
like,
off.
I want
Yeah,
to really, really lower your expectations about comprehension right now because, and if I said like I'm aiming for this exact 45% comprehension, whatever that means, if they're like, I don't know if this is 45%. I don't know if I'm understanding enough or too little. And so I really wanted to just undershoot it and be like, I expect you right now to just sit and look at my pictures. That's all I'm asking. Like, I don't,
Mhm.
yeah. And so it was really more about managing expectations so that they participate, so that I can continue telling my little story. And then I can do the work of making it comprehensible with like sheltered language, repeated words. Like I have all my little sheltering practices that are going to ideally make it more comprehensible than less comprehensible. But yeah, it's just responsiveness to me knowing my students.
Yeah. And I think maybe to sum this up as principles, then, like, so if you're looking at somebody teaching, either you're there in their classroom in person, that's awesome to get to do. You're watching a video of them with their students. That's also great. Giving a diversity of people, diversity of languages too, languages you already know, language you teach, language you don't know, so that you're getting these different angles on it and remembering that there's a context that's going in here and that you are going to be learning how to apply principles in your own context. This is how it looked in this one setting, this one time. And it may look a little differently, but you could be carrying out some of the same thinking and same principles there. So the other thing I wanted to suggest, though, about like what does this look like, is to take a class, like really to be a language student. And there's some great online options for that. We can list some of those. I teach Mandarin Chinese online, and some of my students are language teachers because they value it as a professional development thing, as well as they're gaining Mandarin Chinese from it. And I've taken language classes that way myself, in French, in ASL, in Spanish, in Vietnamese, those few most recently. So I think all of those different experiences kind of add up, and over time we kind of change our mindsets, and knowing that it really truly is a growth process. And like you started out saying, Reed, like neither of us feel like now I'm done in
No,
the way that I'm going to teach, and I'm just going to keep on repeating exactly this. Like, no, I want to try this thing, or I've heard about that. I want to see how that works. Or
yeah,
like, to me, that's the excitement of language teaching, and it's why
yeah,
I'm still doing it, even though I have a full-time job doing teacher education,
right.
because it was really exciting. I just taught my first Mandarin Chinese class this morning, so it was
Congratulations.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I guess if I had to sum up what does it look like and I had to give some kind of answer, if I walk in a classroom and I see that the teacher is using the language with the students, or maybe they're in doing some kind of small group thing and the students are using the language with each other, are the people in the classroom using the language to talk about something or to complete something or to get something done? Um, then I would say that's probably very likely a good example of a communicative classroom. A marginal example that I brought up before that I think is not ideal, but it counts. I think it counts as communicative and there is input going on, is when the teacher is using the target language to check homework answers. That is use of the target language, and I would call that communicative. I would keep watching though to see like what's happening next. Because checking homework answers is real. It's a real thing. But are you going to do anything else? Are you going to have a
Yeah,
discussion about a text, a discussion about a picture? Are you going to work on something collaboratively together? Using the target language to do what should be like the main thing happening in most of the class. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Right. And it should be mainly in that language that's the new one, or the one that's being acquired through the class. But there may be a mix of languages. And
Oh, yeah, and I'm not saying cut out all English. Yeah, yeah.
right.
And when people ask is translation okay, I say if it's supporting use of the target language, then that's to me a general principle. We can get into the weeds about maybe some good and bad practices within that, but
Yeah.
um, I would say a bad example that is very common is where a teacher says way too much that is not, we don't know if it's comprehensible or not. Maybe it's a few sentences and then, or maybe it's a lot more, but then the teacher then just translates everything into the native language and then moves on.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
that to me is just not, that's not a good use of translation. But
Right.
if it's a little sandwich, if it's something
Mhm.
where the teacher then shows that students are engaging with that target language that was cleared up through translation, that to me is okay. If it's playing a supportive role in the use of
Yeah.
the target language, Yes, I'm okay
Yeah.
with it.
Or I think too, a selective use of like, I'm just not going to put this word in the target language because it'll add to their mental load,
Mm,
or it's just not part of my goal right now to get this word in. And I've
sure.
seen teachers do that too,
Yeah.
where they just
Make a
throw the
judgment.
noun in English,
Yeah.
but basically they're speaking in Chinese or that sort of
Yeah.
any other language it applies to too. But I think especially with languages that are quite different, like English to Chinese doesn't really share cognates at all. There's some loan words back and forth, but they're few. And so, yeah, we end up doing a little bit more of that maybe than even feels likely needed in Spanish or in French if your students are English speakers.
Yeah.
So,
Yep. All
yeah.
right. I
Oh,
think
yeah.
that's it.
And then while I'm thinking about
Mhm.
Mandarin, Andy also had a kind of a follow-up, when to introduce characters.
Oh, yeah.
It has come up a number of times as he's worked with Mandarin Chinese teachers.
Y-
And can I go for that one and then if you want to
Sure.
fill
I'll
in?
jump
And
in after. Yeah.
yeah, so there are a variety of approaches within a kind of comprehension-based thinking about this. I have seen people who, well, here I'll sum up by saying what I see as most effective in terms of the process that I'm looking for students to go through is to focus first on connecting sound to meaning. And I use Pinyin, and other teachers also use Pinyin for that, particularly if these are learners brand new to the sound and the meaning of words in Mandarin Chinese. So they're hearing sounds, they need to connect up with, okay, that means that. Okay, that means that. Okay, that means that. While their brains are so hard at work doing that, if you're also asking them to see a character and Pinyin at the same time and recognize all of that at once, now you're really overloading their working memory. And so delay the characters. I delay it only a short time so that it's kind of a front-loaded sound to meaning. And when I start to see that students are comfortable with those new words, phrases used in context, so words and phrases are coming up as we're communicating in the class. And then I start to hear students are using those words appropriately. They're answering questions confidently, even if the answer is just a big old head nod. They're drawing something that corresponds to it. Somehow I'm seeing good comprehension for that sound and meaning. Now I feel okay about adding, let's do some reading that has characters in it. So it's kind of like this
That
module
has that
approach.
character. That has that character in it.
That character in it, yes,
Right. Yeah.
along with other ones that they've already seen,
Yeah.
again, in the context of a broader message-based
Sure.
experience with this language. So I'm not talking about drilling,
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not talking about just vocab work. I'm
Yeah.
talking about
Yeah.
using language in context to do something else
Yeah.
communicatively.
Yeah.
So I have heard of this kind of thinking in many different ways. Michael Everson wrote about this in like 1990. Terry Waltz has called that kind of, she has a very specific approach to it called cold character reading, where again, you're building listening and oral skills before you introduce characters in reading. And I like that a lot. And I like it module approach so that it's a little bit more building on your listening comprehension and then a little bit more with your reading and then a little bit more. And so it's like this slowly expanding kind of cloud of
Yeah.
first leading with listening based
Yeah.
development and then adding reading. I have seen other teachers do other things. Some will read in Pinyin before they ever read a similar text or the same text in characters. Okay. If they, there's different ways to kind of carry out the point by point things. But to me, if you're reading in a new script and it's a character script where there's never going to be the phonetic help within the characters that's adequate for a student to just look at it and go, oh, this sounds like that.
Yeah.
Like if they're new to reading Russian, reading Arabic, Greek,
Korean. Yeah.
Hebrew, Korean.
Yeah.
Something that has a more phonetically written alphabet-like language, then I think there may be a little shifting around. Thai is like this too.
Yeah.
Where eventually they're going to be able to read exactly from that script because there's a way to make sense of the
Decode
sound, meaning,
Sure.
connection. Yeah.
Yeah.
So for the very beginner where they're new to the script, I would still stair step it that way. But Chinese characters are almost never going to be phonetically
Yeah.
guiding you enough to
Yeah.
be sure you know how to say it unless you hear it first.
Th-
So I still do a lot of that all the way through intermediate levels with heritage learners of Chinese, kids who speak Mandarin Chinese with their families at home, for example. even those who may not speak standard Mandarin at home, but it's quick for them to pick up the Mandarin sounds. I do introduce characters right away.
Yeah.
Because I think they're okay with that. For the non-native, I would delay it in the way that I just described.
Yeah, the heritage, the competent heritage speakers that I've worked with, I find that they'll show me sentences in characters. Maybe they got it from Google Translate. Maybe maybe I typed it out for them, but I just watch the speed that they'll pick it up, and they'll use a lot of like other cognitive things going on. I could just see them using context. It's like they'll read a sentence and then they'll say the wrong word where a word should be, but it makes sense in that. And I go, oh, it's this other word, and they'll go, oh yeah, okay, and then they got it the next time. Like they're so quick. So yeah, my solution for a lot of questions about like, I don't know, a lot of things related to language acquisition and writing systems in general and things is that if you define language as a spoken system and not a written system, which is an issue among Chinese scholars and society in general, that it answers a lot of your questions. That why is this like this? Why do people read it this way? Why do people pick it up so quickly this way? If you think of like what's going on in the brain, what's going on, like how does the mind process language? It's a spoken system, not a written system. And then the writing is an extra system. Right. That it answers most of those questions. Like it just resolves so many things. So yeah, the kids you can see them relying on what sounds right in their mind.
Right. And you want to build that whether they're a heritage learner
everybody.
Or a totally non-native learner.
Yeah. So teach the language as a spoken system, not as a written system, which, language classrooms are typically very reliant on textbooks, and it kind of by default trains everyone to think, this is my perspective, but I see everyone seem trained to think of language as a written system and not just Chinese. Look at the words on the page. That's the language. I think it's a normal society, modern society default way to think of like, what is language? It's this words on a page. That doesn't reflect intonation, rhythm. There's so much prosody in how we talk. That's part of communication. It's not there on the page, and you can't ask people to know how it's going to be read. So yeah, Chinese. The other thing I was going to say about those phonetic scripts, I used to do demos for grad school. Classmates would invite me to come do a Chinese demo. I would do a cold character reading-ish kind of thing. I don't think I was following Terry Waltz's exact steps, but I was doing something that was audio, build up a story with students for maybe 20 minutes, very few words. And then the rest of the time we would read in different steps. We'd read together chorally. I'd pass out copies and read together with classmates. And then I would get feedback at the end. And it always went really smoothly when it was Mandarin Chinese and Chinese characters to read afterwards. But then I started doing Hebrew, and I taught myself just a little bit of Hebrew. I tried to do similar kind of reading activities with linguistics classmates of mine at UH. And I found that it wasn't taking, and like time after time after time, like it wasn't taking, and they were getting really stuck on the specific letters. And they're like, why can't you just teach us the specific pronunciations of each letter? And I was like, this is supposed to work. This always worked for Chinese. So I have a new view, which is that Chinese characters are each distinctive enough from each other that even though they don't represent phonetics in any reliable way, you can go, oh, that's the one with the little crossy thing at the top. Oh, that's the thing with the little angle on the side. And it's pronounced this one way that I remember from our story. There's something distinctive about Chinese characters, whereas when you look at Hebrew words, they're recycling all the same letters over and over, and they're really hard to distinguish from each other, which is just true of any phonetic writing system, even English.
Yeah. Think of C, lowercase c, E, O, A. Yeah. I mean, those are really close to each other.
P and Q and D, and like, my daughter mixes them up all the time still. She'll see a D and call it a Q. She's 2. So yeah, I think that you'd think that Chinese characters would be harder to learn, but actually, if you think of language as a spoken system, and then you just attach these distinctive symbols, it could be any symbol, and just say every time you see a star, it's war. And every time you see a cup shape, whatever emoji, you just sort of wrote attaching them.
And let me just suggest, I would say that's not where you want the learner to end up with Chinese characters. You want them to be able to discern the components of characters and see those repeating things
eventually
throughout characters.
Yeah.
But and this is interesting because I haven't seen people use this except one of my professors was Chuan Ren Ke, Dr. Kut had unpublished research from the late 90s that he referred to, and he's published things that mention this unpublished research in a Chinese as a acquiring Chinese as a second language. Let's see, I forget the book title. I will link it in the show notes. But the thing that he referred to is he did a study that was never published, and I wish he published this, but it was about studying learners' process over time in how they recognized characters. And they all typically started with this kind of whole sense.
Yeah.
They weren't, even when they were taught components first, when they were seeing new characters, at least this is my memory of it. And when they saw new characters, they kind of had this holistic, like you just called it, rote memory kind of a thing. Like, yeah, here's this whole thing. And I remember that in this context sounds like this, and it means that. And so if they could pretty much approximate the sound of the word, other studies, like Everson has done studies where if they could tell what it sounded like, they were probably going to know the meaning as well. So in characters, that was just a finding, highly correlated.
Yeah.
So the thing was like, even when we're trying to help students develop that like component-based knowledge of characters, for sure, I would say do it. But I think more effectively, it's going to be not all the front loading of it, but doing it again and again and again as they see that character come up.
Right.
And then start, oh, hey, did you see this part here in this word that shows up over here? And do you know, this word is that, this word means that. How do you think that's going to carry some meaning in this new character?
There's a general education principle, which is to tie things to prior knowledge. And when they don't have prior knowledge, they haven't been reading characters in context, giving them that componential, here's the breakdown, here's the grass radical, it always means this. The other problem I have is I see students over apply rules that are taught, and then it gets in the way of new learning. But they're like, no, wait, that one has a water, and so this is supposed to be water. And I said, that's Mayo to May. May just has a water in it. Like, no. We learned that if it has the three dots, that means it's water. Like, not in this case. Like, there's so many frequent cases, like high usage cases that do not follow whatever rule you were taught. So I try to avoid telling them rules. If something feels generally useful to me, I'll say, okay, here's something that's generally useful, but please do not over apply this as a big rule. And that's true for grammar. It's true for character components. It's true for pronunciation. I try to just steer my students away from over focus on any kind of rule.
Yeah, like here it does this.
Yeah.
Can I just throw out a thing though about May?
Yeah.
Because
it used to mean to sink. It used to mean to sink.
Yeah. I was going to say, like historically, because it's also the word for to drown.
Right.
It's pronounced differently.
It's more than.
Yeah.
Sure. And that's the history.
So like submerged is like not have. And
that's one of the ways I convince my students to not follow rules, is I say that language wasn't created overnight by someone with a bunch of rules on a whiteboard. It historically is just a bunch of borrowing of words to mean similar meanings that just keep drifting over time. And now we're just sitting on the current sediment. Like, this is just the current sediment layer of where the words mean what they mean now. And in 500 years from now, they'll all have drifted into new meanings. Like,
you might be able to dig down and find it sometime.
But the historical record shows that. It's so when people say, why is this like this? It's just because of accidents of history, just little community choices over many, many hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of years. So stop looking for rules.
Be comfortable with the ambiguity of not having a clear rule for everything.
Well, and the slow and piecemeal nature of acquisition, that it's going to be, you cannot apply rules to guess your way into meaning or form or sound or anything. You got to have a community or a teacher or someone else who is already in that community to say, no, here, this means this. No, here, this means this over here. Good try. This actually is pronounced this way over here. You can't guess your way into language. Yeah.
Right. And which is a good case for why is input so important. And it's input within the community of people using the language. So it's, it's very tied to a particular context or another.
Yeah. Community norms.
Yeah.
All right.
Instead of world rules.
Yeah.
Question 2.
Yeah, let's do it.
Part 2. Okay, so we have several in this list, but Amy has a question. She kindly expresses gratitude for the podcast, and thank you, Amy. That's really nice to see. Actually, I don't think I read this one to you, Reed. She starts it off, "Good morning, dynamic duo." So yeah.
I might have seen. You might
did
have
you see
texted this to me? Okay, keep going.
Okay. Okay. So Amy says she works with a lot of Spanish teachers who teach in a more traditional way. And again, trying to help teachers adopt new practices. They have some concerns, and often, what's the grade book going to look like at high school levels
Oh yeah,
of language classes?
sure.
And then tied with that, I think, is, answers to those who feel they have to cover so much and
Mm.
cannot get off their timeline.
Hmm.
She says this comes up a whole lot,
Yeah,
a sense of having to cover things and then not being able to slow down or adjust
sure.
the pacing.
My first question would be, because I've seen this so many times, that teachers often make a leap into whatever the textbook is presenting. Uh, but if you say, okay, so is your bigger goal that the students can communicate, use the language, have proficiency? Yes. Okay, so that should be the main thing. Then I see teachers leap from that into, okay, to get there, we're going to have to cover, like, look at this textbook. It's got all these grammar rules. We have to get through all of this to get to that. And the same thing with standards. You say, okay, let's look at the standards. Hawaii State has recently rewritten our standards to align with ACTFL. Diane, is that something you can
Yes.
comment on?
Yeah, we should link to the things that Hawaii does a lot of great stuff.
It's a small community. We can, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
yes, but you still are doing a lot of great stuff. And some of those resources, like I was hired to help in the rollout of those new standards that many teachers were involved in helping to develop. The first and second years had certain training, and then the third year had some other training. So some are on unit design, some are on assessments. Assessment and grading was a topic this fall in a webinar on that. And so there's a lot of things that would be very helpful, I think, that Hawaii has
Sure.
made available to anyone for free on the internet. So
Yeah. So what I wanted to, because of the mention of colleagues in the question, I want to add this to the list of other things that you can present standards. And then again, teachers will say, okay, yes, standards. Okay. To get there, we got to get through all this stuff in our textbooks. And so there's often this there's no mention of the textbooks and the standards. There's no mention of those grammar rules and vocabulary lists in the standards. There's no mention of what textbooks or vocabulary lists or grammar to be taught in the descriptors of proficiency. That's just something teachers keep bringing with them. And so this is not yet
thinking that's very difficult.
I don't yet have an answer. I'm not at the answer yet, but I want to start with sort of picking apart the problem like an owl pellet and kind of finding what bones are in there.
Yeah.
So that I think that's one of the first problems is this sort of teacher belief. I mean, that's how the research would talk about it, is teacher beliefs. And not just beliefs that they say, but beliefs that they show they have when you watch them teach. And so teachers will say, yes, I believe proficiency is important. Students have to be able to talk and use the language. Let me show you how I teach that. And then you see them explaining grammar and covering huge vocabulary lists and, slide presentations, explaining each vocabulary word, typically not in the target language. Not that it even should be, because it would be too much to do in the target language.
Right.
So that I think kind of gets a common problem, and I'm not saying that's your exact problem, but it's often there's a probable possibility that that's similar to your problem. There is no immediate solution. I mean, that's what Diane and I talk about all the time. Is like, what's the quick fix? Oh, I wish there was a quick fix.
Wish.
Yeah. It's frustrating.
Yeah,
I
but
think
maybe just the openness.
Yeah.
To like, okay, there's this new set of goals. I might have to learn new thinking about how to get there too.
Yeah.
And I think that is not necessarily as readily obvious to people.
Yeah.
Like, new goal. I'm going to throw my old stuff at it even harder to get to that new goal. I'm like, no, wait. Maybe
that gets
that's
at
not
another
going to
problem.
serve you.
Is I've heard teachers say this many times, like, well, obviously, I'm not going to throw out 10 to 20 years worth of materials that I've written. So what else do you want me to do? And that is exactly what I do. And teachers who I love watching teach will often coincidentally say, oh no, I throw everything out every year. I remake new things every year.
Yeah. You learned from the process of what you did before, but you don't have to redo it.
And you think, oh no, I have better ideas now. Yeah, I think that for a lot of teachers, it's a job. They want to be able, they've already put in the hard work. They don't want to put in the hard work again. And
And there can be legitimate reasons for that. I
yes,
think sometimes
absolutely.
people are very critical about
No.
teachers, but like they have lives,
Yeah.
they have stress levels, they
Family.
have training or not. There's a lot of reasons. So
Yeah,
yeah,
and a
we're
lot
not
of
saying
people
that to
have,
be
yeah,
critical of them, but
organized their lives around the assumption that, hey, I thought I was done creating the materials and assessments. I don't really have
right,
time to like take things home and work on stuff now.
right.
I did, and I thought I was done with that. So one solution is to create time during school. My dean has been offering this. I'm the subject area lead for Japanese and Chinese at my school, and when I meet with my dean every 2 weeks, we've talked about some curricular changes that probably should happen if we're going to align with what the IB says is just mandatory for language acquisition. It's the assessment in reading and listening using authentic texts. And I'm being very diplomatic with the teachers saying, keep doing everything you're already doing. I need you to add this little piece just so we can say that we align. Our online management system, our grade learning management system, has the rubrics already like set in stone. You just tick a checkbox, it pops down for listening, reading, speaking, or writing. And when you click on the listening or the reading, the rubrics show up immediately, and they're all in reference to authentic texts. And I had my own definitions of listening. I was like, well, if I ask questions about their presentation, clearly that's listening. Uh, yes, it is. However, it doesn't at all resemble the rubrics that the IB
The IB
system is
wants you to use,
providing.
yeah.
That's exactly right. So I have to go and make that extra time to figure that out. I'm also just very patient with myself to say, I don't have time to develop that right now. And that's going to be a project for next year. Um,
Hmm.
and so that's something I'm also passing on to my teachers is saying, okay, a goal for fall 2025 is that you'll do at least one summative assessment using an authentic listening audio piece or videos, okay? And at least one summative assessment using an authentic reading text. And we can meet and discuss what you have in mind. You can pare it down. It could be a single sentence from a news article. That's what I do with my ninth graders. I have real
Right.
news articles and I select the key sentence, one sentence, and we work around that. We have discussions around it. We do other things with it. They have to not memorize it, but do the work to be able to read that one sentence.
Mhm.
And I think that's fine for that level. I triple the load in 10th grade. And then 11th grade, we're doing a bit more. We look at kind of infographics that have whole little phrases in it. And then by the second semester of 11th grade, we're reading bigger paragraphs. And it's very gradual that I'm pushing them into it. And that's not all we do. It's just that is going to be necessary at the end of their IB culmination in the exams that have these very long texts that get harder and harder and are always about some sort of societal issue and have a lot of vocab the students have to know.
Yeah.
So that's my institution. But yeah, I would just say go back to your teachers and check in with standards and just go through it and it is very confrontational. It tends to hit very deep for teachers who have such core beliefs around
Yeah.
the teaching and memorization of grammar and vocabulary because that's often like their belief about what the definition of language is. And
Yeah.
it's so core and central that it could be very this is a feeling of like dislodging like the
Yeah.
central spine of something
Yeah.
to
And
be like
even
that
attacking
central
their
thing you can't
identity
do.
of
Yeah.
who they are
I'm
as a
so good
teacher,
at this. Right.
what makes them a good teacher, what
Yeah.
makes them feel successful. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's big. And to acknowledge that it's a real thing. It's a real part of change.
I think, like you said, participation in demo lessons
Yeah.
can be something where teachers often first ask those questions. We've had these at conferences a lot where some teacher starts asking, like, hold on, where's the grammar? And we're like, oh, it was in there. It was in the communication. Like, well, when do you teach? What day would you start teaching like this? Like day one.
Yeah.
That could be
We
some
just
of the
did.
first
Yeah.
kind of like, yeah, shaking a little bit of those beliefs. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's one solution.
Yeah. Should we pause here and
Yeah,
then
jump back
start
on.
again? And then maybe respond to Amy. And there's several others, but we might need to wait for another episode.
We could do that. Yeah, and we could just end with this one and say thanks. We have more questions, but
Oh, true. I think we
or
got to it.
yeah. Let's jump
Well, I could
off.
say grade categories. That might be helpful. Okay, so
Um,
we're back.
yeah. Yeah, cut off. Okay, let's
And
go.
we were going to talk about, Amy, some ideas for maybe categories of grading, that I was required to have a certain type of grading process in the high school where I last taught. It was not the interpretive, interpersonal, presentational, communication categories, but I think that's a really nice one. So that I would put in the same bucket of interpretive things, I would do things with listening comprehension and reading comprehension sorts of things. Again, whole language experiences for a purpose beyond just practicing language, something like that. So would I ever test individual vocabulary? Would I ever test specific grammar points? No,
Yeah.
no, I wouldn't. And I didn't, especially at the high school. We had it still broken down, I think, into the 4 skills model. So there was like listening, reading, speaking, and writing. And it was compositional writing. I was using typed things mostly. I wasn't really grading them on Chinese handwriting and ability with characters.
Yeah.
That's another question. If for interpersonal communication, I used a rubric that students use to self-evaluate, and then I would give them a rating, and then we could talk through, I'm not seeing the same things that you are here. And so it was on the use of the target language to communicate in the classroom. I also had, when I was required for that speaking kind of assessment, that would have been an interpersonal communication grade too, because it was back and forth in real time without rehearsing or memorizing in advance. And so those speaking assessments that I did, I have, I'll put maybe a link in the show notes, because I have some recordings of what I did with students. I took 4 picture series where the 4 pictures were from the Chinese AP test, but there are other kinds of 4 pictures that tell a story. And then I would let the students see several options. They would, within about 30 seconds, they would need to choose one that they felt most confident to be able to tell me about. And then they would describe what they saw in the pictures. I would ask some follow-up questions. So that's why it's interpersonal and not just presentational communication at that point. I would say, if I were dream world, I would say in like year 1, I would put a much heavier emphasis on interpretive than either interpersonal or presentational
Yeah.
use of language, because I think that's developmentally appropriate for a novice learner. If you've got an intermediate kind of a student, they have some productive ability. Maybe some simple presentational things are more appropriate. For a more advanced learner, again, yet even more, but that interpretive mode is where I think the first
Yeah.
key part of developing the other skills is coming from.
Yeah.
So
Presentational can also be scaffolded for
yeah,
novices. And so
yeah,
they're not showing their language, their acquired language, but they are showing their ability to organize a presentation.
yeah.
And
And that can
oftentimes
be, yeah,
that's a useful thing in life. And so, if they could put slides together and, if they just, memorize the name of like some places, some locations they would travel to, for example, or some foods they would eat, they can also use like really basic sentence frames like 我
mhm,
想吃, like, I would like to eat, or 我想去, I would like to go. And it is input for classmates. It's not a waste of time, especially having many classmates do these presentations.
right.
And it can feel very, very gratifying for students to be like, hey, I understood that presentation. Um, and so, yeah, it could be heavily scaffolded and largely based on some memorized
Right.
stuff. So you can still do presentational, but it might
Yeah,
not,
but
might
the
not be as
expectations
interesting.
are different.
Yeah, expectations are different. It might not be as interesting as what they're showing they can interpret.
Yeah.
Um,
And so I would recommend grading these kinds of things with rubrics of descriptions, and maybe even having students self-assess
yeah,
a lot of the time, so that they're to what
yeah,
degree did I
yeah,
do XYZ well?
yeah,
What would be my next step? Kind of reflective process, so that the students are
yeah,
really more in charge of their learning, or they are hopefully getting that idea and given that autonomy.
yeah.
So
As
that's
far
what
as
I would look for.
convincing colleagues and teachers goes, I've had some success, and I've heard stories of teachers who are close to me talk about success, and I get a general sense that even your more conservative or more traditional teachers, um, they're interested in doing more interesting things. It just shouldn't be on the whims of, the eccentric colleague would be you or me. And so
Right.
like when I was at UH, we were discussing reforming the assessments for the first year Chinese 101 class. And everyone was proposing all these very traditional kind of, oh, we could test vocabulary, less vocabulary, more vocabulary, and we could cut down the grammar. We could do this kind of grammar thing for their tests. And I brought in sample tasks that were like, reorganize these pictures according to some instructions in the target language, or narrate this little story from these pictures. And I think I took them from the AP exam. I made sure that it wasn't me inventing things, that they would see that it was me sharing things from something bigger and authoritative in the world of language teaching, specific to our language too. I found that when I would share things from Cambridge handbooks for language teachers, typically it's really assumed ESL. In my mind, I could easily think, oh, great, I'll just do this, but in Chinese. And a lot of my my teacher colleagues would say, oh, but that's for English. So it's very,
Right.
it's every opportunity to dismiss it. But I found that once it was like, I found that like there was true convincing happening if it was from the target language, if it was for something that could be a goal for students, if it was something that was already in practice somewhere else, developed by someone authoritative, and I was just the messenger.
Yeah.
Then I did see real buy-in, and I saw people actually stop waving it off and show actual genuine interest, not excited interest, but just enough interest to be like, yeah, I guess we could do this. And then that's all we needed.
Yeah. It's close enough to what they already believed in that it wasn't, some radical thing. And it's again, that's like
Yeah.
teacher learning, effective teacher learning needs to have that step-by-step thing. You
Yeah.
can't throw them so far so that they have to take 10 new steps
Yeah.
to get to this new thing. So all those steps of buy-in are great. And I think providing something that you don't have to create it from scratch. But here's a good model piece.
Right.
Maybe
Right.
in the future,
Yeah.
we'll work together on
Yeah.
developing a new one for, Spanish 1 and
Yeah.
at the end of the semester. And like step by
Yeah.
step.
Yeah. You have
And
lots of time. As my dean said to me, if you want people to change, they have to have their own personal buy-in. They have to really see the reason why. They have to have lots of time to do it. And then I think she just said those two. And then I was thinking also a third one would be lots of support during the process.
or safety to make
Yeah.
mistakes too.
Yes.
But that kind of ties into support, like the sense that like the thing that I think I've said before on this podcast was like, rather than seeing yourself as a teacher who does XYZ practices, like thinking of yourself as a teacher who learns and grows. So I'm a teacher who learns and grows. Oh, this is an opportunity for me to do that.
Yeah.
Okay,
My
this is
practices
who I
are
am.
always changing. Right. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So then you can try something new without feeling as threatened by it.
Right.
And together, I'm a teacher that learns and grows. Of course, I'm not going to do it right. That's why
Yeah.
I'm in process,
Yeah. Let me go get messy. Yeah. Let's try this out.
Mhm.
Yep.
Exactly.
I love that.
And as a recovering perfectionist, I need that all the time.
Right. Okay. Well, that was fun.
Yeah.
Thanks for the question.
Yes. Thank you, Amy.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Amy.
Right. Okay. So this one is from YouTube. And I'm not sure the name of the person, and I'm not sure I can say the account correct, but it's a comment from episode 19, Listening Comprehension as a Goal. The person says that they are interested in these comparison studies. What do you think are some key things to watch out for in the methodologies in studies that compare TPRS to other methods in listening, speaking, reading, and writing? So maybe talking about those, like in studies, what methods, like how should we interpret and understand the methods used in research studies when you're comparing different kinds of teaching approaches?
There's inherent messiness in comparing all of these, and it's just going to be part of it because these are often action research studies, teachers looking at their own students, and it's not in their goals, and it's not typically in their training. Some are probably trained on how to do, quality research, but even if they were all trained in high quality research, there's no mandate to anyone doing research to follow one set of methodologies. Everyone kind of has their own research questions.
Research methodologies specifically. They're
research
just
methodologies.
Talking about teaching methodologies, and then,
for example, do you randomize students into two different groups? Do you teach everybody for one set of time and then see what they gain, and then teach them with a different method and see what they gain? So the studies are not going to be all the same. I think that typically whoever does a kind of bigger meta analysis, someone like Karen Lichtman, will typically report on what those differences are. I think one thing you want to do though is don't even a meta study that compares a bunch of previous studies, um, that itself is just another study, and you never want to treat any study as definitive. They're all
Right.
just lending weight. They're lending weight toward ways that we can think about the process of what is going on in classrooms, what's going on in the mind brain, what's going on in, with how language develops over time.
Mhm.
So I wouldn't have high expectations about any sort of perfect methodology or
Right.
yeah,
And it too, it depends very much on what your question is going after. So here they're wanting to see like results in listening
yeah,
comprehension or results in reading or
sure,
writing. And
yeah,
so how those are going to be measured and when those are going to be measured
yeah,
is going to be really important. So if you could have an intensive teaching time and then an immediate follow-up test where they look great, but does that last in 3 months? But then in those 3 months, maybe they've had a whole lot of other different experiences with language since then. So, like, where do you attribute? Like,
yeah,
it's very difficult to
yeah,
attribute cause to something that they've experienced.
right,
And so, like, all of these things, like, yeah, it's easier to say, like, in this context, when they did this thing, this immediate result occurred.
sure,
But that doesn't mean that every time anywhere somebody
yeah,
does exactly this thing,
yeah.
that it will turn out exactly this way. And that
I
I'm actually
yeah, I
very, very skeptical about a lot of quantitative research because of that. I think it can hint at possibilities.
right.
It can tell us something about the brain may do this. Learners may come out with this, but I don't trust the predictability of it all that much in
Yeah,
educational stuff, particularly
especially yeah,
because of the
education
complexity.
specific. It's complex. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
people are so complex as they go into this, and then the
yeah,
testing approach is very complex. And then the fact that you may have a lot of
yeah.
other factors going on in there. And yeah, so
Yeah, so
I just think
there's some very
go
general
gently.
takeaways. Like when you look at TPR, for example, TPRS compared to other methods, um, if it was strongly one way or the other, like TPRS just bottoms out, no results every time, then I would say, this doesn't seem to do anything. Like I would say that that's a pretty strong case being made. It
Yeah.
doesn't seem to do anything. But if you get a kind of wishy-washy, just as good as, maybe slightly better than, then I say, okay, it's fine. Um,
Yeah.
and it really sets us up for next questions. Like I'm still really curious about the listening outcomes not being as strong as the other outcomes in Karen Lichtman's comparisons of the studies. That doesn't tell me that TPRS isn't as good at listening. That's not my takeaway from that. What it tells
Right.
me is that now we need to look more at what's going on there to uncover the process of how it is that listening didn't turn up in these studies so well. Maybe it was a measurement problem. Maybe they weren't
Hmm.
measuring listening in a way that really
Or
reflected
in the
listening
same way
abilities or the
across
same
these
way.
different studies, or
Different
yeah.
studies measure differently. We don't know. And so that to me is like I take a very careful view on any kind of research to see it as one link in a long, long, long chain that's always being added to, instead
Right.
of like this is the end. Like this is
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
proof. I'm not looking for proof. I'm not looking for it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other side of it is like that's all looking quantitatively at those kinds of issues and just kind of taking snapshot images of the outcomes in a certain way. But I'm also really interested in the qualities of what's happening in the classroom. And
Yeah.
are students enjoying this process? Are they becoming actual language speakers? Are
Right.
they developing the intercultural resources to be people who relate to people from around the world? Like those are things that I don't want to like totally remove from an understanding of what's happening in a classroom. So like
Yeah.
if those outcomes are lost, but they can really, I don't know, do
Yeah.
XYZ thing well, I would say like, well, my goals for language education aren't even being addressed by this kind of research because I
Yeah.
want it to be this holistic thing.
Yeah.
So we need multiple kinds of studies. I'm not saying toss the quantitative. I'm saying don't just use and
Add
don't
to it.
just
Sure.
value. And
Yep.
and so thinking about what's happening between people interactively is really or in interaction is really important to me as well. The
Yeah.
quality of the experience for the people as they go
Yeah.
is really important.
I
So
mean,
so I want
if
to see things
yeah.
like that too.
Yeah. Here's a violent metaphor. This is a if you if you wanted to meet a person and then you said, "Oh, I can't meet them all at once. I just need a little slice of that person."
Mm. Yeah, that's gory.
That's a horrifying way to think of it, but that's what we're doing when we measure educational outcomes. We're taking
Yeah.
a small, we have to take a small slice of whatever's going on because our research question could be so broad as to say, is this a good teacher? Is this a good classroom? That doesn't help us design anything to capture anything. Maybe you can make a survey. Is the students, students feel it's a
Do
good
they
teacher?
feel? But then
But that
you're
doesn't,
defining it like
no,
we're studying student perceptions about the educational quality of their teacher or something like even
no,
then
it's not getting it. So you end
yeah.
up asking a hyper specific question, and you could get something that to your satisfaction answers that question, but it doesn't get at the big picture of was this an effective classroom?
Hmm.
You always have to define it more narrowly, and then you end up missing the bigger picture.
Right.
Yeah, and how did the person turn out 20 years from now? Because of that classroom. Oh, that's too messy. I don't even know if
Right.
that's measurable.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I just think that we have to really, really change, lower, tamper our expectations, to go in with just a really patient mindset.
Right.
Yeah, don't expect too much from research. Great
Yeah. Not, it's
expectations.
certainly not from one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. That's all I have to say about that.
Yeah. And I think
Cool.
too, yeah, and I think this listener knew, but in case somebody's jumping in at this point, there's episode 5 was on what can teachers get from research, and I think we mentioned some of those kinds of things there too.
Yeah. And we probably said the exact same thing there.
Very possible, but
We
yeah.
as researchers don't put a lot of stake in research. Well, we do. We do because it's the best we've got. Yeah, I
Yeah, it's
often
little pieces of evidence that
it's
you
pieces
can
of
stack
evidence
up over time and
that are way better than no evidence.
yeah.
Yeah. I think if you went back 50 years and looked at a TV set and you said, "Hey, that TV set's nowhere near as advanced as, I have in my time." Those were the steps it took to get to where we are now. And TV's 100 years from now, they'll probably be very different from now. And you can't have jumped from then to now. And so that's what researchers are doing. They're just doing the little steps that just gradually get us, something a little better. And if you understand how research works, you're not looking for the definitive end to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, one other thought though about like what would I look for in a research methodologically? I
Mm,
would be looking for something that takes this kind of thing into account so that
sure.
the authors of the research themselves are not overplaying
Oh yeah.
what they're trying to say.
Yeah.
Like we've done it for all time kind of an answer.
This is the
I
proof.
want
Yeah.
them to be able to see like our evidence is strongest with this kind of student with this
Hmm.
language with this
Mm,
sort of setting with
yeah.
this kind of I want them
Yeah.
to be able
Yeah.
to recognize those things too, and while there may be other places that it's also applicable, you want to be more cautious at the least
Yeah.
about applying it in another setting.
Some things I do look for. I look for their definitions. Are they clear about what
Yeah,
do they tell me what they're
that's
talking
great.
about and give me their definitions? It's even better when they review older definitions from other research and then either
Yeah,
say we're going with this definition from this other research or we have a new definition that fits our purposes. As long as that's made clear, then I know
yeah,
what you're talking about. But if
yeah.
you skip that part, then I don't know what you're talking about.
Right. It's when I was doing my dissertation research, engagement was one of the constructs that I was looking at, like student engagement in the process of interacting during class. And I'll post it. It was an overview of research on engagement in language classrooms. And the scholars found that like only I want to say 20 or maybe it was 50% of the studies that they surveyed actually defined engagement.
Right. Right.
Like, so the assumption was made that they knew what it was, but they
Yeah.
never said, this is the thing that we're looking at, and this is how we'll know if we see it.
Right.
And so they were saying, like, please, researchers, please make things plain and
Yeah.
clear and tell us what you're looking for in a
Right.
way that's not just throwing the word around.
Yeah.
So,
Hmm. Yeah. Yep. And yeah, that humility.
yes.
This is what we found. Here's some limitations. More research needs to look in these directions. Um, yeah, I'm definitely looking for that in any research studies. The
Yeah.
acknowledgement of this. This is the little piece. Here's what can come
Hmm.
next. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, this has been our Q&A episode.
Yeah, and we do have some other questions that we'll come back to in another episode in some
Yeah.
near future episode.
Yeah.
How's that?
I hope this episode sparks more questions.
Yeah, send them in. And if you do hear this and want to send them in, probably easiest is our email address, conversationsaboutlanguage@gmail.com.
Yeah, not the full title of our podcast.
Right. That
Mhm.
was too long for
Conversations about language at
Yeah.
gmail.com. Well, thanks, Diane.
Yeah, thanks, Reed.
Hui ho.
See you next time.
See you next time.